Many decades ago, this area of Manhattan used to be one of the most densely populated areas in the entire world. The neighborhood was known at first as the Lower East Side, and then because it got so dense with different ethnic groups, it gained its own identity known as Little Italy. In these neighborhoods, you would be surrounded by businesses that would look like this, and people crammed into tenements. However, amidst this beautiful neighborhood vibe was also a shadow of the illegal crime dealings of the Mafia. But what is the Mafia? Well, for that, we have to go at least back to the 1800s, if not further. In the 1800s, Italy was recently reunified into one single country. A lot of the north was the main manufacturing hub. So the north had a lot of the capital, a lot of the money, a lot of the power. The south didn't. The south produced raw materials. Thus, they didn't have too much power. Especially further south you went, all the way to Sicily. In Sicily, the government barely cared, and there was barely a rule of law. So, because of the fear of authority, there was a group that formed called La Cosa Nostra. And La Cosa Nostra means our thing in English. This is our modern day mafia. Because from the tiny little island of Sicily, many of those immigrants start sailing out across the Atlantic Ocean to cities like New York and establishing the extension of those crime families right over here. However, there are only one out of three main mafias that we know of today. The other one being Nangreta, might be mispronouncing that, they're from Calabria, and the other one being the Camorra, they are from Naples. The mafia was significantly cracked down in Italy. It was getting very nasty by the 1970s and the 1980s that Italy cracked down and arrested hundreds of mafiosos. But they had a challenge in the beginning while trying to crack down on these guys. So when trying to crack down on the mafiosos, people in 1960s, 1970s Italy would say the mafia doesn't exist. People in the government will also say, what are you talking about? Mafia doesn't exist. It's a conspiracy. Here in America, people would say the same thing. Mafia doesn't exist. Maybe there's a few gangsters, but there's no mafia. There's no boss. There's no Godfather. This is stuff of movies, stuff that Francis Ford Coppola made up. And they would make you think that it is literally a conspiracy, like Freemasons or the CIA LSD experiments. They would make you think it is a straight conspiracy. That was due to probably the most important code of the mafia called omerta. And omerta means that you don't talk to police, you cannot be seen hanging out with the police, you cannot talk to other mafiosos unless you're introduced by that other mafioso by someone higher than you. So even mafiosos couldn't relate to each other. And also they had a code of honor when they related to treating their wives and their families with respect and other things. And that's why there was such a big denial of the mafia ever existing. So people just said it was a conspiracy. It's very interesting because I feel like history might be repeating itself with some certain things. But let's go way back to early 1900s, to 1903. This is our first stop. So here we have 8 and 9 Prince Street. It doesn't quite look like anything associated with the mafia. We can see it's in a tenement building, but now it's a place to get your ears pierced and a clothing store. But before, this was a spaghetti restaurant. Yep, a spaghetti restaurant that was the main headquarters and the place to do their criminal dealings of the very first mafia family of the US, the Morellos. This was Morello, the clutch hand, they called him, because he had a deformed hand. And with that deformed hand, a lot of Italians back in the mainland had a very terrible superstition. They distrusted people and they were afraid of people with deformities. And thus he was able to rule with fear. However, they were mostly small-time petty thieves. They weren't really making that much money. And thus, a man came from Sicily. He is known as the very first Godfather. This Godfather was Vito Cassioferra. Vito Cassioferra is the one who established the real mafia here in New York City. He installed a code of honor. He also made sure that they organized their system better, and thus the real mafia of New York began right here. But in 1903, a barrel was found many blocks away on Avenue D in the modern-day Alphabet City neighborhood. Inside this barrel, they saw the body of a man stuffed inside. They end up finding that his throat was slashed from end to end. This was one of the many barrel murders of 1903. And this was the inciting incident for New York City's law enforcement to finally get wind of what was happening in the underworld here in New York City. Let's go to our second stop. The person who ended up catching Morello was one of the most feared NYPD officers of the early 1900s. He was the very first Italian American to serve in the police force ever in the entire United States history. Most of the police at that time here in New York City were Irish Americans. So they quite did not like having him on the force, but they had to do something with the Italian community because they were being terrorized by this guy. Not because he was stuffing people to barrels, but he was also involved in something called the Black Hand. The cop that we're talking about is what this park is named after. His name is Lieutenant Joseph Petrosino. This is Petrosino right over here. Now, Petrosino was only about 5'3", and at that time there was a height restriction. They ended up making an exception for one very important reason. He was actually fluent in many dialects in Italian. He was battling a criminal ring that was sending these letters to Italian Americans with a knife cutting through a black hand saying, "Give us your money or we will break your arm." They will stuff you in a barrel, shoot you and stuff you in a barrel. They would stab your heart, or they just might decapitate you. So Petrosino had to do something. So this guy was in deep cover. He was also known as a master of disguise. He was so into his police work that if he were to come across his own daughter on the street, he was known to not acknowledge her in the least bit. So he can continue fighting crime. But who was the Black Hand? Well, the Black Hand is a bit like the Mafia, but kept getting bigger because the Black Hand kept getting more famous. There was more stories related to the Black Hand. Well, one of the people involved in the Black Hand was our guy Morello. And back in Italy, after Morello was arrested for the barrel murders, after they were all sent to prison, Vito Cassioferra fled back to Sicily. But he still had his hand in the Black Hand. So Joe Petrosino sets up an Italian squad, 6 guys. Here's a photo with a few of them and one of the main mafiosos in the center. Now remember this building, because this building we're actually going to walk through it soon. So what happens with Joseph Petrosino? Well, he knows he can do one thing. He can go to Sicily to gather information on Cassioferra and the other Sicilian Cosa Nostra. If he got information from them, he would be able to come back to America, bring it over here, and finally take him down for good. So he went over to Sicily, asked for permission to have Secret Service accompany him. The United States refused because he was Italian. He went on his own to Palermo. And in Palermo, Sicily, he ended up having dinner. And Cassioferra, who was also having dinner a few blocks away, got wind. And according to legend, no one knows this 100% for sure, Cassioferra excuses himself from his family, goes out. One of his henchmen tells Petrosino that there's an informant that has a very vital, important information about the Cosa Nostra. Meet him at a random street alley corner of Palermo. And he goes over there himself, Cassioferra, takes out his gun, shoots Petrosino a few times. Police were right next door, didn't do anything. Witnesses saw the crime. One witness said there was like multiple shooters, there was 2 or 3. Another witness said it was some random dude. Another witness said it was some random thief. Another witness said, I didn't see anything. It's because Omerta was deeply entrenched in the Italian community because there was a distrust for the authorities. So even in the Italian communities, the very Italian Americans did not complain about the Black Hand, and in Sicily they did not snitch. They were also probably afraid of the Mafia as well. So they didn't want to snitch on the Mafia and be implicated. So no one knows exactly what happened to Petrosino. We only know that he was shot to death in Palermo. His uniform is still on display in Sicily. So right over here, we have the old New York Police Department headquarters. This was the police headquarters from 1909 all the way to 1973. Now this is a beautiful Beaux Arts building. This was built by architects Hopin and Cohen in 1909 in the Beaux Arts style. Beaux Arts is like a kind of a mishmash of classical elements, maybe Roman, Greek. Look at that. Wow. So this is where Petrosino used to work. Now, why did Petrosino become so influential as a police officer? Well, it was actually because he was friends with the police commissioner at that time, Theodore Roosevelt. The man who eventually became US president was good friends with Joe Petrosino. But is this still a police headquarters? Well, in the 1970s, they ended up vacating the building because it was too old to modernize. And it stayed vacant until 1988, when it became something else. It makes a lot of old school New Yorkers shiver with fear that their city is being lost. These are condos. These condos are one of the most lavish condos in all of New York City. You can live inside the dome if you wanted to and have these beautiful views of Manhattan. Now, the price costs $11.6 million for that penthouse. Some things are more scarier than even the Cosa Nostra as development. We're gonna zigzag our way through Little Italy and see more. This is the Basilica of Old St. Patrick. And it's named the Basilica because it is deemed by the Pope as of historical importance for the Roman Catholic Church. But why is this so important? Well, this was established in 1809, and it was to serve the very beginnings of the Irish community over here in New York City. Let's go much later. Let's go to a young boy who became an altar boy here in the church. His name was Marty. His last name was Scorsese. Yep, Martin Scorsese, the famous director of many amazing films like Raging Bull, Wolf of Wall Street, Gangs of New York, worked right here as an altar boy. And he ended up using this church for 2 films. One of them being Mean Streets, where he had a pivotal scene with Harvey Keitel. But there's a second famous film that was featured inside here. And that film was The Godfather.
Michael Francis Rizzi, do you renounce Satan?
So here we are at one of the most famous streets for Little Italy. This is Mulberry, historic Mulberry Street. This was the heart of Little Italy, all the way since Italians started coming here in the 1870s. But right here was this place. Looks like any normal storefront. But in 1926, you remember that guy Morello? The ones who succeeded him opened up the Knights of the Alto Social Club. This place hosted many people of the likes like Lucky Luciano. Lucky Luciano is probably one of the more famous gangsters of the 1920s and 30s. But due to a lot of different dealings, they end up killing Anastasia. After him, the Gambino family took over. This was converted into the Ravenite Club. And when it became the Ravenite Club, the guy who was the underboss of the Gambinos was this guy with the white hair. His name was Neil Della Croce. People knew him as Mr. Neil. Many police officers, when they looked him in the eye, they said that he was one of the most terrifying people that they ever met. The guy right next to him was his underling. In a way, almost like his son. His name was John Gotti. When Gambino got arrested, he ended up promoting basically the businessman of the operation. His name was Paul Castellano. And this pissed off John Gotti. But Della Croce, who was still underboss, he told all of his underlings, including the John Gotti, to stand down. But why did they hate Paul Castellano? Well, the reason they hated Paul Castellano was because he was more in tune with white-collar crime. He really didn't know too much about the streets. He also really didn't care about continuing racketeering businesses and gambling businesses, and especially the very, very profitable heroin business. He put a full stop to selling heroin. This was concerning for John Gotti because he knew how much money they were laying on the wayside with heroin. So Mr. Neil passes away from lung cancer. Finally, John Gotti can start gathering his own underlings in order to take down Castellano. John Gotti is now the new crime boss of New York City, the head of the Gambino family. But this was the mid-'80s, and by the mid-'80s, New York City was having enough of the mafia. So they end up putting bugs into the Raven Night Club where he used to hang out. So this photo was taken by a neighbor, and this is the Raven Night Club. He ended up actually bricking over the gloss facade so he can maintain privacy. Gotti would be out there chilling as if nothing was happening. But the FBI had a whole lot of surveillance on him. And this is the surveillance that they put right next door. Did they get anything? No. All the recordings inside the main area were all just chit-chat. Wasn't talking anything about the crime dealings, so they couldn't implicate him. However, John Gotti was doing is that he was moving right next door. He had a secret entranceway to go to the next tenement building. That's where he would talk all about his crime dealings. The FBI got wind of that, and they end up bugging, putting microphones and also video. That's where they got him. In 1992, John Gotti was convicted.
Once again, John Gotti faces the prospect of life in prison. With prior felony convictions for attempted manslaughter and truck hijacking, he could face a stiff prison term as a persistent felon if convicted a third time.
Since then, the Raven Night Club has obviously become a different business. It's now a shoe store. However, inside the shoe store, the owner gets inundated with questions about John Gotti and the mafia because it actually has a remnant of those era. Here is the original flooring, and according to the owner, one time, Japanese tourist coming over here, and he offered her $400, and he actually bought a piece of the floor. That, ladies and gentlemen, are the mafias and the gangsters of New York. Are they still around? In some way, but we really don't know how because their methods haven't been so obvious. Maybe they follow more the path of Paul Castellano with more white-collar crime, dealings more with Wall Street and real estate. I'm Ariel, this is Urbanist. I hope you enjoyed this tour. Keep being awesome and always keep on exploring. Have a great day, everyone.